Hey everyone, welcome back to Brazil Crypto Report, a podcast produced by Activo Media and Advisory. I'm your host, Aaron Stanley, and today I'm joined by Shinan Looi, who's a managing partner at Onigiri Capital and a partner at Saison Capital, which are both headquartered in Singapore. Onigiri Capital recently announced a new $50 million investment fund with a focus on blockchain projects in Brazil, Latin America, and elsewhere. So we're going to be diving into that today. But before we do, I want to give a quick shout out to our show sponsor. We have Avenia, who's building seamless infrastructure for cross-border payments in the Americas. We'll be hearing about them later in the show. So with that, Shinan, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Aaron.
So yeah, to get started, would love you to give us kind of the elevator pitch of what you're working on. What is Onigiri Capital? What's Saison Capital? What's the interest in Brazil, Latin America?
Take this from the beginning. This really begins with our parent company, Credit Saison in Japan. It's a 75-year-old company that's listed on the Tokyo Stock Exchange, and it's one of the largest credit card companies in Japan itself. With more than 35 million cardholders and 30 billion US dollars AUM, one might think it's the typical large Japanese corporation. Now, the interesting part starts 12 years ago. When Japanese companies usually expand globally, most often they go to US as the first market of choice or Europe, the developed Western markets. However, for Credit Saison, we are very different. We are entrepreneurial in our DNA. So 12 years ago, when we decided to expand overseas, we decided to look towards the global south, starting with emerging markets. So fast forward to 12 years, today we really have two business lines outside of Japan. One is in private credit and the other is in venture capital. We started this in India, then we expanded to Southeast Asia, and very excitingly, just slightly more than 2 years ago, we landed on the shores of Brazil and Mexico as part of our Latin America strategy. So to maybe quickly run through what each of these verticals does. On the private credit side, what we do is we leverage low cost of capital in Japan, and we essentially export this capital out to emerging markets of India, Southeast Asia, and LATAM, where we lend to fintechs. So this puts us in a very sort of unique position in the market because we, instead of going direct lending right from day one, what we prefer to do is to find local partners, strong local partners to work with. And that is the model that we've adopted in Brazil since 2 years ago. So we have set up an office in Sao Paulo. Today, it's more than 20 people on our private credit team investing in many of these fintechs. Now, the venture capital comes in to very nicely complement it. So on one hand, we provide debt capital, and on the venture capital side, which is where I come from, we provide early stage equity capital. So the entity that does the venture capital is what we call Saison Capital, which was started in 2019. And in 2024, we started investing in Brazil itself. Then comes the blockchain piece also, right? And that really sort of sets us apart, and is one of the things that I'm most proud of. When I joined the fund in 2021, I helped to kickstart our blockchain investments. And keeping in mind, this was early for a financial institution to actually invest in this space at the early stage. It took us 15 months to get across the line, but very proudly, we are one of the few financial institutions today that can invest in blockchain startups, not just in equity, but also in tokens. And this was when FTX, Terra Luna had all happened. People were removing blockchain from their websites. People were pivoting away from blockchain and trying not to talk about it. But we continued to keep our perseverance and kept our belief in the technology. And we invested in more than 40 early stage blockchain startups. That has done relatively well. And more than just the financial performance, what we realize is really that many financial institutions are starting to experiment with blockchain technologies on how it can be used to create new financial products and services. So we decided to establish Onigiri Capital, which is a venture capital fund that is run and backed by Credit Saison. But for the first time ever, from the venture capital side, we have taken external capital. And this external capital comes from other financial institutions. We're talking about your banks and your asset managers out of Asia that want to leverage blockchain. So we're really excited to launch this fund just a month ago. And one of the key focuses of this fund is actually going to be in Brazil geographically, right? Ever since we understood the Brazil market, we have been really fascinated and excited about the potential. Happy to deep dive that into a little more. And this fund is also very focused. We are only going to invest in the blockchain startups that are building financial products. This means stablecoins, payments, tokenized assets, financial markets infra, and DeFi. So these are the 5 areas that we invest. We don't do cryptocurrencies, we don't do NFTs, we don't do gaming. So yeah, that's a bit about us.
No, that's amazing. Thank you for that intro. That I have lots of follow up questions here that we'll kind of take one by one. But like, I'm really impressed by the strategy and the vision, even kind of the commitment to plowing through, getting these funds like kind of launched and operative during the FTX years was definitely a challenge, I can imagine. But you stuck with it. Maybe before we dive into that, I would love for maybe a bit more just be like personal background on you. You seem like a fairly young guy, but like, kind of tell us like, how'd you get into venture capital? How have you closed so many deals in such a, in, the early stage of your career
Yeah.
so far? I'd like to take a moment to tell you about our show sponsor, Avenia. If you're building a wallet, a crypto consumer app, or a global payment platform, Avenia is your bridge to Latin America. You can instantly connect to PIX, SPEI, and CBU using stablecoins with a single API. No banks, no FX desks, no SWIFT. Head over to avenia.io to learn about how you can move money globally with full compliance and real-time settlement. Now back to the show. You seem like a fairly young guy, but like, kind of tell us like, how'd you get into venture capital? How have you closed so many deals in such a, the early stage of your career so far?
So I was very fortunate to start my career 11 years ago when I dropped out of Stanford, gave up a full ride government scholarship to actually build a startup. This startup was based out of Singapore, but we quickly grew it around Southeast Asia, and we were the first generation of venture-backed founders. The company is Glints. Today, it's one of the largest HR and recruitment tech companies in the region. That is a Series D startup, and has raised more than $80 million. So I was there from day zero and was building the company with my 2 other co-founders for 4.5 years. And I think that shaped a lot about my views personally and also professionally in terms of how this space works. And I think the idea of being able to create something that's fast growth, rapid, was really stuck to me. So after leaving Glints, after building it for 4.5 years, I went back to complete my education at Stanford because Asian parents will always be Asian parents. And then I decided to come back to work in this region of Southeast Asia. Right? I didn't even bother spending a single day or effort looking for opportunities in Silicon Valley because I felt like the next growth frontier was very much here in Southeast Asia. So I joined BCG Digital Ventures, what is today known as BCGX, basically the corporate venture building arm of Boston Consulting Group. And this was a fascinating journey because I was working with some of the largest corporations, helping them to innovate, helping them to come up with startups. And then in 2021, Credit Saison came calling, and I decided it would be a great opportunity to cross on the other side of the table from a founder to become a VC. So obviously, there's both good and bad things that I miss from being a founder days. But I'm really sort of glad that even within, let's say, a large corporation, a large institution, I'm able to be a founder again and actually kickstart Onigiri Capital. So that has been my journey so far over the past 11 years.
Oh, that's amazing. Very cool. And it's amazing that you've got, time, doing both roles, like as the founder, as the investor. I think it's very important to have that kind of that, that synergy. Like you know where the other person's coming from, right? Which is great. And maybe talk a bit more about Onigiri's investment thesis. And, you mentioned like 5 of the verticals you're focusing on, like tokenization and stablecoins and payments. Maybe talk a bit more about, kind of why you've decided to hone in on these particular verticals, and not others, I suppose.
Sure. So I would say it starts very much on what happened in 2022, when actually the moment that we got our approval, it took 15 months, right? And it took 15 months to get the approval internally. To be fair, the commercial part of why we should do it took 1 month to get approval. 14 months was really getting things like the risk, compliance, audit, custody, all of that getting sorted out. And by the time we got the approval, FTX had happened. So it was really at the inflection point and a critical point for us to decide, okay, do we go ahead or not, right? I think for us, the big thing that stood out was how we saw blockchain technology as something that's separate from cryptocurrencies. And I think people often conflate the two together, and understandably so, right? Because the first application of blockchain is cryptocurrencies, right? Your Bitcoin, your Ethereum, your Solana. But I think what we were seeing, and this was very much behind the scenes as a financial institution, was how many other financial institutions were quietly experimenting and figuring out how do we use this distributed ledger technologies to improve efficiency, improve operations. So even though FTX had happened, even though the cryptocurrency industry has plummeted, even though there was so much bearish sentiment, what we saw was actually a different group of people that were quietly experimenting. Of course, fast forward 3 years today, people are not so quiet about it, right? Almost every financial institution has publicly declared about it. But I think what we were fortunate to be was to be behind the scenes at that point, seeing all this experimentation happen. And I think that really gave us that conviction to firstly remove these two things, separate these two things. Right? Blockchain and cryptocurrency are two different things. We believe in the technology. We think the technology and the trend is investable. We think cryptocurrency it's a bit challenging because of its speculative nature, right? I think that's the first trend that we saw. And the second thing that we saw is also we saw a lot of financial services that was still outdated, right? I think for us, what was very apparent is that let's say today, I'm here in Singapore, you are here in Brazil. I want to contact you, Aaron. I send you a message, an email, you get it right away, maybe 1-2 second delay. But if let's say I want to send you some money, well, maybe the banks are closed today. It's a public holiday, right? So it's insane that money is not moving at the speed of internet, and we saw blockchain as really the way to make that happen. And the third and the last thing I'll say, which gives us this excitement, is that we operate in emerging markets, right? India, Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, and most recently Brazil. And in many of these markets, people were leapfrogging from not owning any financial instrument or asset or investment to owning cryptocurrencies, right? So what we saw is that people embracing this blockchain trend at the retail level with wholeheartedness. And even today in Indonesia and Philippines, you have more than double the number of cryptocurrency owners versus stockholders. So we saw this huge movement of leapfrogging that was happening in the emerging markets that we're operating on. And it was all these factors that led us to say, okay, this is something we still want to persevere through, and we want to push through, and we want to continue to be building and investing in this space.
Yeah, the point about the emerging markets, that was actually going to be my next question, but you kind of beat me to it. But maybe talk a little bit more about like why the focus on I mean it sounds like this whole conglomerate, like the Credit Saison conglomerate with Saison Capital and Onigiri, like this was a very intentional decision. Like, hey, we're going to focus on some of these underserved markets that perhaps I guess maybe to use the metaphor of like it's like there's fewer, you want to fish in the pond where like other people aren't fishing, kind of thing, right? Like maybe some of these other larger markets are a bit more congested, a bit more competitive. um you look to the emerging markets and it's like, well, there's a reason why there's not as many people operating in these markets. Like there's not as much volume, there's not as much wealth. There's not as, like, some of the regulatory situations might be a little bit less certain, but at the same time there's also a lot more potential if you can figure out how to do it correctly. So maybe kind of talk us through like why was that decision made? Like, hey, we're not going to kind of just follow what everyone else is doing, we're going to really focus on these markets.
Absolutely. I think it really starts from the culture and the DNA for at our headquarters in Japan, which once again I am very fortunate. So here's a sort of interesting anecdote, right? When Credit Saison first called me to say, "Hey, join us at Saison Capital," honestly, I was very skeptical. I'm like, Japanese company, listed, financial institution, regulated. Like, are you guys gonna take 6 months to write 100K check? Because like, let's not waste everyone's time, right? If that's gonna be the case, if I need to get through 5 different committees and 20 people to write 100K check, the truth is you're not gonna be competitive, right? Like no founder wants to work together with you. But I think that was furthest from the truth. It was promised to me then, and obviously they have kept the promise, which is why I'm still around. Which is it's a very sort of entrepreneurial organization. And I think the number one thing that sets us apart, it's, for example, in many when we set up our entities in India, in Brazil, in Indonesia, it's very common for global companies, but especially Japanese corporations, to parachute their local Japanese to be the senior leadership, right? And of course, that brings its own set of challenges because each market is so dynamic, it's so different. Even operating in Brazil versus India is totally different, right? So what we have chosen to do as an organization is firstly to hire local leadership, instead of sort of parachuting people who, let's say, have limited context about the culture, right? So I think that's really sort of a big difference, which is we hire very strong local leaders who then build up very strong local teams, and we have done that very well in Brazil. That's one. The second thing is also there's always this sense of from developed markets, there's a bit of like superiority complex of like, oh, I'm here to save you, right? Like, I'm here to bless all of you. You should glorify me because I'm here. I think we learned that that's not the right approach. We learned that the right thing to do is to work with local partners. So, for example, for on the private credit side, when we enter markets, we don't do direct lending because that's absolutely the fastest way to lose money, right? Because you don't understand the market, you don't understand how systems work. So what we do is we find some of the strong local lenders, the local fintechs, and then we support them by providing debt capital. And honestly, for the venture side, it's exactly the same strategy. When we came into Brazil, we did not do a startup investment first. We invested in venture capital funds, strong local venture capital funds like Norche Ventures, One VC, and Valor Capital, because the idea is we want to say, A, we want to learn from you, and B, let's co-invest together, right? So I think there's a lot of this collaborative approach that we rely on the local partners, the local network to really bring all of this together. And I think that really has led us to embrace all of this risk. Obviously, we also do make mistakes, right? In the game of investment, you never get it right all the time. But I think overall, we have done relatively well as a result of that.
And then maybe talk a bit about like why the interest in Latin America and specifically Brazil. I know we talked about this at length at the Stellar conference back in Rio last month, but maybe spell it out here. Like, what do you see in Brazil that's like really exciting, especially your vantage point, like coming, like literally around the globe, to scout out this market. Like, what do you see here that's so exciting for you?
Yeah. I remember this conversation happening maybe 18 months ago when my global CEO just came back from Brazil. He sat me down and said, hey, you should look at Brazil because the central bank themselves is doing something on the blockchain. And then at that point, I was like, okay, is this just another PR move? Right? Like, obviously, we have heard so many of these announcements that don't lead to anything. But then when I really looked into it, I was blown away, absolutely. Right? I don't think any government or any central bank in the world comes close to what the Brazil Central Bank has done in terms of innovation, and not just on the blockchain side, right? This really started 2 decades ago with things like PIX and open finance, but especially on the blockchain side, I think the regulator, the central bank, sets such an important tone because without that kind of support, what you have is, of course, the grassroots people building, which is important, definitely. But if you truly want to unlock the institutional capital, the financial institutions, you need the regulator, the central bank, to say, it's okay, we support it. And I think Brazil has done a fantastic job, not just in talking about it, but actually doing it. So, for example, launching Drex, going through the different phases and adopting a pragmatic approach, right? Not saying like, oh, yay, let's just jump 2 feet in, but instead of doing it in a very logical approach, working with global leaders. I think Brazil has really set the role model for many countries, not just emerging markets, but even developed ones, as the benchmark for how we should embrace this blockchain innovation. So, long story short, when we understood what was happening, we were like, okay, this is the place that we had to be. I first landed in Sao Paulo June 2024, so just slightly more than a year ago. Started to speak with the ecosystem, and once again was just impressed, not just with the regulators, but also with the founders. What we saw was the quality of founders, the quality of companies to be a lot higher than in many other regions that we see. And a lot of these founders were also building in the exact spaces that we cared about: stablecoins, payments, and tokenized assets as the core focus areas of ours, right? So I think all of those factors have come together, and naturally we spend more time in the market. We even sent one of our team members from Saison Capital to be full time over here in Brazil, and we're also building up our local team. So all in all, we truly believe, I truly believe, right, that Brazil will be home to some of the largest outcomes in the blockchain and finance space. And I think that's also important because the market size needs to be valid, right? For example, Singapore, Hong Kong are excellent markets also for blockchain innovation, but the truth is the domestic markets are limited, right? And of course, expanding overseas is always easy to say on podcasts or on papers, but it's actually a lot harder to execute. So I think being able to have a supportive regulator, to have a strong technical infrastructure and a large enough domestic market, it's really the right ingredients that Brazil uniquely has.
Yeah, and I think what you've discovered here is something that perhaps a lot of the other maybe blockchain focused venture funds globally perhaps have not quite figured out yet. I mean, there's we'll give credit where it's due. There are a lot of them that have been active here and looking around here, but I think it's still a market that's still fairly off of people's radars, perhaps more than it should be. So I definitely give you credit for realizing this, perhaps ahead of your competitors or your colleagues in the venture industry. Um, and then maybe practically, I mean, you mentioned just some of what you've been up to initially is really just kind of partnering with some of the local funds who are a bit more in touch with grassroots builders and founders and whatnot. But maybe talk a bit more. What are the types of founders, projects, use cases like you're looking, to source here, and then maybe also, if you have deployed into any companies thus far that you can talk about, you can disclose, that'd be interesting as well. But maybe talk, like, what are the types of projects that you're like, what would be kind of like the prototype of like, ooh, that's exactly what I want. Like that's the type of deal I'm looking to fund.
Yeah. So because we just launched the fund last month, we haven't invested in any Brazil startup as of today, officially, but actually there are multiple in our pipeline that we're very close, and we are very excited about. Hopefully in the coming months, we'll have good news to announce, right? For example, in April, because of our relationship with Valora Capital, we had access to Crown Digital, which is building a Brazil stablecoin. That is one company in the stablecoin vertical. In the payments vertical, we have Avenia, which is a supporter of yours, and we also have Trace Finance as the two companies that have done very well also in this. And on the tokenized assets front, I'm personally quite close to AmFi Finance, so that's Paulo and his team. So I think in all of these verticals, what we're seeing is firstly very strong founders who come from traditional finance backgrounds or even fintech backgrounds that have built successful companies, and now they realize the transformative potential. And for many of them, to be honest, they are already relatively successful, right? Do they want to go through the glass eating process of starting another company? Well, the answer is yes, because they see this as a huge enough opportunity. So let's maybe just take a few minutes. I'll talk about MFi, right? I got connected with Paulo and the team about a year ago. And truth to be told, when I first heard about the business, I was like, okay, I've seen my fair share of tokenized asset companies out there, right? People who try to tokenize private credit and done it. But I think really what was really sort of impressive was how they are able to generate organic investor demand for their products, right? So this was something that it's not commonly found. And I think that was something that really stood out. And B, they actually managed to generate meaningful revenue. So I think that really stood out as a high quality founder, high quality company targeting a domestic market and really making these private credit products accessible to retail investors. Because otherwise, getting access to this relatively attractive asset class used to be quite challenging.
Yeah, and it does feel that in this part of the world, right, just because the cost of capital is so high and securing venture funding is relatively difficult compared to other parts of the world, it does feel like a lot of the startups here they've have to kind of perhaps do more with less compared to perhaps their brethren in more developed markets like in the U.S. or Europe, where at least maybe up until a couple of years ago, like you could raise a few $1 million with just a pitch deck or whatever. It wasn't that difficult. A little more difficult nowadays, but it seems like a lot of these founders in Brazil and these startups have really, they've learned how to really deliver with like limited resources, right? And they're kind of ahead of the curve. They aren't just living off of a huge raise that they did a couple of years ago and kind of riding it out or whatever. Um, but I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. Like, how do you have any observations on like how some of these teams you've either invested in or you've been talking to here in Brazil maybe compare with perhaps folks that you'd find in other parts of the world that you operate in?
Yeah, and I think what you mentioned, Aaron, is absolutely spot on. And to us, that is our opportunity, right? Because, like you say, the venture capital funding can sometimes be limited. I would say, especially in blockchain. We have spoken with almost all of the venture capital fund managers in Brazil. And to be honest, only I would say a small segment of them truly understand the space and are actively investing in it, right? And I think as a result of that, for many of the founders that are in this space, what was clear is their motivations for doing this are obvious, right? As you said, they are not going to come in to just raise a monster round and live off it. So that is great. You have a lot more resilient founders and founders who are in it for the right reasons. And B, what we're seeing is a lot stronger revenue focus. So the truth is, at the C or even at the Series A rounds of these Brazil blockchain startups, we are seeing metrics that we don't even see at the same rounds, even in places like Singapore, Hong Kong, or even in the US, right? For the same valuation, I can get a company that's making $2 to $3 million ARR, whereas someone else, let's say in outside of Brazil, would have just signed a POC pilot that is unpaid, right? And it's such a different sort of magnitude in terms of the quality of companies that we underwrite. And some of these Series A deals that we're looking at, the companies are already profitable, right? So I think that to us is like incredible because what it shows is that there is a real business over here. They are raising capital to accelerate the growth, but not to pay OPEX, right? Not to pay salaries. And I think that's the exact kind of businesses that we want to build. Of course, it's not all rosy, right? We are very conscious that a big part of it is how would they grow, let's say, past the $300 million valuation mark, right? And also who will be able to provide growth capital for these businesses. I think those are still unanswered questions. And ultimately, the exit, who will provide the exit, that's also a TBD. But I think all of these are risks that we are willing to take, right? At the end of the day, the word venture in venture capital has to mean for something. So I think that's something that we are prepared to take the risk in terms of, I would say, more of a macro or market risk. But I think in terms of the individual quality of these companies, we're seeing it to be so much higher.
You actually just touched on what was going to be my next question here, which was what are some of the main obstacles, would you say, to deploying capital in this part of the world versus other regions where you operate? I mean, you mentioned, yeah, had a few points in that last answer there about some, finding the growth capital, exits, et cetera. But like, what are some of the, what are some of the challenges or obstacles you see at this point, and maybe further down the road?
Yeah, in addition to the growth capital exit part, I think one of the things that, of course, is always top of concern for us, it's in terms of how the regulations continue to develop. As I mentioned earlier, Brazil has already been very positive and very forward thinking, but that's really in terms of, let's say, certain segments, right? Which is, let's say, in the blockchain innovation. For example, the taxation system in Brazil still remains extremely complicated. Now, how do these blockchain startups solve these issues? It's also remains to be seen, right? In particular, what we want these blockchain startups to always remain compliant and not to be seen as circumventing, let's say, taxation rules, right? Because that's not ideal, and it's a matter of time before it gets closed down. So I think there are many of these outstanding issues that remain unanswered, unresolved, and I'm not sure whether there will be even a near-term fix, right? To be fair, these are not unique to blockchain itself. It applies to pretty much every industry out there. But I think that that's also some of the risks that we have to deal with. It's just that when you talk about digital assets, when you talk about blockchain, the bar is a lot higher, right? Because of the perception people have of this, that, oh, it could be used on money laundering, it could be used to be circumvent rules. And to be fair, it's a fair comment, right? So I think the job is on founders, is on investors to really demonstrate that we are beyond reproach, right? That we are here to work with the regulators. We're not here to circumvent the rules. And I think that partnership will continue to evolve as more and more parties get more clarity on how this space grows.
Yeah, it's a great point. It's worth maybe like just reemphasizing that some of these issues are not unique to blockchain at all. There's definitely, the business climate in Brazil it's been improving, but it's still like not, we'll celebrate once we get into the top 100, on the World Bank doing business index, right? But it's getting better, but it's not where it needs to be, right? I think everyone can probably agree on that, irrespective of what industry you're in. And then maybe you're a former founder, so I'll ask you to put on your founder hat here. But for a founder or a startup in the region, what's the benefit of having like somebody like yourself, Onigiri Capital on their cap table? Like, why should they be looking at you guys and be excited rather than, skeptical? Like, who are these guys coming all the way around the world? Like, why should they be excited to, to have you, looking to deploy capital in the region and into their particular projects?
I think that that's a very valid question, and one thing that we always internally have a joke is this what we call tourist investors, right? They're here for the good times, but when times are tough, they leave. Look, I think for us, the one thing that we want to emphasize over again, it's we are committed. And we mean business, right? For us, Onigiri Capital is part of the broader Credit Saison group. On the Credit Saison Brazil side, we're more than 25 people in our Sao Paulo office, and this is really the team that we work together as one team, right? So this is not something that we are not fly in fly out investors. If you need people to support you, we have local teams on the ground, right? So we're here to stay. But I think more than just providing capital, there's really sort of three key reasons why people work together with us, why founders work with us. The first and probably the most important, it's really to capitalize on our institutional access, right? Most of our LPs are banks, are asset managers, and we ourselves are a financial institution. So, by extension of that, it means that we have an extensive and trusted network in finance, and we can help founders navigate the complexity of partnering with institutions. We think this is important because to sometimes think about how do you sell to a bank? How do you get an asset manager to support you? That can be quite tough, especially for founders who have not done it before. Or even if you've done it before in a large organization, to do it for a startup is not easy. So, really helping founders to access and navigate institutions, that is one, in fact I would say that's the most important thing that we do. And sometimes it's also not just about getting to a yes, right? Of course we want partnerships to happen, we want institutions to say yes, but sometimes we see our job as also getting a quick no, right? For example, don't waste 6 months trying to prospect a bank if they are still skeptical on blockchain, right? So maybe what we can do is we can very quickly, within 1 to 2 weeks, get you to the right person, help you figure out, okay, they're keen, they're not keen, and then we move on from there. So that's one. The second piece is, of course, the gateway to Asia. So we are born out of Asia. Asia is where is our home ground. So we offer founders our unique insights and success of working with investors, regulators, founders in a market that is very different, but also in many ways very similar to LATAM. And the last piece is also we spend a lot of time building visibility and validation for our founders. So through events, through publications, we work very hard to create the awareness for our portfolio. So really, institutional access, gateway to Asia, and visibility and validation. Those are the three big things that we offer to founders.
And on the gateway to Asia point, it does seem like there has been kind of historic correlation between the Latin America and the Asian markets, right? There's obviously there's a lot of Chinese activity in Latin America, and there's a lot of stablecoin remittances and things that are happening. Um, but I mean, recently, even the last couple of years, I feel like I've been seeing more of the Brazilian teams like traveling to getting booths at Token 2049 and trying to like really kind of have more of a just more of like a presence or a footprint or just in that part of the world, or even at least just kind of saying like, hey, we're here. If you want to do business in Latin America, come talk to us, right? So it does kind of seem like this Asia LATAM corridor is perhaps becoming more, maybe it's not becoming more important than it was before, but at least becoming more visible. But maybe I would love your kind of take on it from, I guess you're coming from the Asian side of that corridor, but like, I mean, what do you see the significance of this corridor, kind of currently and maybe in the years ahead?
There's a very cliche saying is that today the opportunities that are most lucrative are actually more than one flight away. And I think in many ways that's very true, right? The world has sort of globalized in such a way that anything that you can reach in one flight distance, it's probably, many other people have already done it. And I think to me, that's really where we find opportunity, which is getting from Asia to Brazil, in particular takes more than one flight, right? In particular for Singapore to Sao Paulo, it's a 30-hour trek, which is often relatively backbreaking. But look, I think sort of the key point over here is that there is a lot of similarities in the market dynamics, right? These are two of the fastest growing regions in the world. Both of them have very young populations. The average age of both regions is probably in the late 20s to early 30s. And it's also a very digitally native, very hungry for new products, for innovation populations that we have over here. So I think there's a lot of similarities where we see both Asian and Latin founders being able to export their technology, their products, their services across these borders. And especially for the blockchain space in particular, the whole point of blockchain is to make things global, right? Borderless, transparent, accessible. So I think the idea of, let's say, a Latin founder launching something in Asia or vice versa, it really puts to test the value proposition of what blockchain has to offer.
I love that. Well, Shinan, really appreciate your time today. Congratulations on deploying the fund and getting that all set up, and really looking to see what type of what types of moves you make here in the coming months in Brazil and the region here. And for folks who are looking to get in touch or learn more, how can they find you? And then I guess any other final thoughts you want to leave with our audience here.
Sure. I can be reached on email, on WhatsApp, on LinkedIn, but I guess LinkedIn is where anyone can reach out to me. My email is listed on my LinkedIn profile, so it's open. You don't have to dig for it. It's right there. So please drop me a message, drop me an email. We would love to meet founders. Maybe as sort of our parting message, the one thing that we always emphasize to founders that we work with is that trust cannot be bootstrapped. Now, what does that mean? In financial services, a lot of what we do it's underpinned by trust, right? Why do we leave most of our bank balances? Well, okay, maybe not in Brazil, but in the rest of the world, we still bank with the traditional banks, right? Yes, there are neobanks, yes, there are e-wallets, but I think for the majority of people, you still don't keep your entire, let's say, savings or assets in, let's say, a new wallet, right, or a new fintech app. We still keep it in a traditional finance bank account. And why is that the case? Is because we trust them, right? These institutions have been around for centuries, and they're regulated, and that trust cannot be bootstrapped. So what the message we want to send to founders, it's instead of trying to figure out ways of building trust by yourself, which obviously takes time and effort, partner with someone like us, right? Partner someone like Onigiri Capital, partner with someone like Credit Saison, or partner with a local financial institution. Find someone who has already that trust and then work together with them, because I think that will be a lot more efficient. And that's how we really sort of help this to scale. There's a lot of baggage that blockchain and digital assets carry from its past. And I think we really need to change the mindset, the impression people have of this industry. We can only do that when we work with people who already have that trust, right? So constantly think about how you can build trust and in many ways borrow trust from existing players. I think that's the parting message I would love to leave to the people listening to this.
Well said. Hey, well, Shinan, really appreciate your time. Congratulations on everything. Yeah, looking forward to seeing what you have in the works over the coming months. And thanks again for your time. And thanks everyone for watching. And we'll see you next time.